Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world today. Thanks for joining today's live stream. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent technology agnostic consulting firm. And I'm going to introduce a guest here in just a moment. I have a guest with me, as you can see on your screen. But before I introduce that guest, I'll do a couple housekeeping items. The first thing is we're streaming live. Obviously, this is a interview that's going to become part of my weekly Transformation Ground Control podcast. And you get to be part of the live audience in the production of that podcast by being here to ask questions and engage with us. So I encourage any of you on the live stream here to drop any questions or comments you have for either of us in the chat box on whatever platform you're listening on today. We're streaming to YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. So glad to have you all on the live stream today. And I'll be keeping an eye on all the live streams here in front of me. So just feel free to pop anything in the chat you want as we're talking here. And today's topic that we'll talk about is going to be the topic of alternatives to big ERP software vendors, sort of those household common names that a lot of organizations are familiar with, SAP, Oracle, Microsoft, et cetera. Those are the big names that everyone kind of knows, but what are those options maybe you don't know about? How viable are they? Are they good, credible options for your digital transformation? That's the sort of thing we want to talk about here today. And before I introduce my guest, one last thing. I want to ask a favor for everyone watching this live. If you could just drop in the chat where you're joining from today. Where in the world are you? What city are you in? What country are you in? We tend to get a pretty good global audience here today. Dan and I happen to be on different continents here today. He's in the U.S. Today. I'm in the UK. So, and there's many of you that might be in one of our countries that we're in, or certainly other parts of the world as well. So we'd love to hear your comments here of where you're from. So just drop that in the chat if you don't mind. We'd love to hear your feedback there. So again, our topic today, if I could speak, our topic today is alternatives to the common ERP vendors in the marketplace. That's what we're going to talk about today. And with me today is Dan Aldridge, who's with Priority Software. And rather than try and explain what Dan does, I'll just welcome you to the show, Dan. And thanks for being here. And maybe tell us a little bit about you and what you do here.
Sure. Thanks a lot. So I am the Director of Pre-Sales and Sales Engineering at Priority here in North America. I live in outside Washington, D.C. in Reston, Virginia. And I came from the consulting side. I've been a consultant in ERP and business management systems for about 25, 26 years. So I date myself going all the way back to a company called BAAN, B-A-A-N, that I started at. And they were sort of the Dutch SAP back in those days, mid 90s. And I worked for them. And then I built a consulting firm with that product, and my company was bought by Priority in 2016. So I came from the consulting side up until about 4 or 5 months ago now. I joined the sales team. I'd been doing a lot of demos and things like that, but I was director of consulting. So I kind of have a consultative type sale that I do, and hopefully inspires trust in companies that we're working with the sales team on.
Yeah, and I thought your background is a good reason why I wanted to have you on the live stream and on the podcast here today, is because you've worked with multiple systems that are good alternatives potentially for a lot of organizations, good alternatives to the big guys, the big SAPs, Oracles, Microsofts of the world. And so that background is certainly going to help you. You've sort of seen this mid-market space or upper mid-market market as well. And I think you have some unique perspective there. So that good. Well, thanks again for being here. Thanks for that introduction. I guess just to start the conversation here, what do you think in general, what do you see as some of the pros and cons of just migrating to one of those bigger known name brands, if you will, those household names like SAP and Oracle? What are the pros and cons of sort of going in with those options as your vendor of choice?
So obvious pros would be market awareness, lots of companies, references and things where they're running it. They tend to be the larger enterprise guys that have been around since, mid 90s or even in some cases 80s. So there's a perception, at least, that these are very stable systems that, they've had a lot of successes in the past, and maybe friends and C-levels tend to favor the big enterprise systems if they're larger companies because of reputation and because of success stories. But that's sort of the pros. And then, it's like they used to say about IBM, right? You can't go wrong if you go with IBM. And I think the same can be said for SAP or Oracle. But, reality as it is not exactly like that. So the span of it is potentially huge. The cost is sometimes prohibitive, and you got an on-premise system that gets locked in and things like that. So the pros would be the name recognition, the lots of successes, but the cons would be also lots of instances where they ran long and they, had trouble after they went live, maybe shutting down business at a very extreme.
Right. Yeah. You remind me of one of my favorite counter phrases to the whole nobody ever get fired for hiring IBM, or, insert big company name here, Accenture, Deloitte, SAP, Oracle, whatever. The only problem with that is you may agree, I don't know if you agree with this or not, but I can name a lot of people that have been fired for picking one of those big name vendors. So
yeah, and they put it on their resume and they move to the next one, right? So you're C-level.
Yeah, and it's such a incestuous industry too that once you're in a vertical, whether it's SAP or Oracle, or you're working with one of the big system integrators, you tend to stay in that space, and so you tend to drink the Kool-Aid and perpetuate a lot of the same strengths and weaknesses of that solution. So I think that's a good point you bring up there. Mm-hmm. Okay, so and I'd be curious too from the audience here listening with us live, what are if you've been through an ERP evaluation, or if you have experience with systems other than those big names that I've mentioned so far, what are some of the systems you've worked with or familiar with? I'd love to hear from the audience here. So maybe just drop in the chat what ERP systems are out there besides SAP and Oracle, let's just say, and Microsoft. Let's pick those three: SAP, Oracle, Microsoft. I think we all agree those are pretty well-known names. But outside of those three, who are some of the other players in the space that should be on people's radars? I'd love to hear the audience questions, and certainly we'll ask you that same question too, Dan. So before I get to your answer to that question, though, Dan, I guess just to take that previous question one step further, or sort of shift it a little bit, instead of talking about the big name vendors, the pros and cons, what about the other vendors in the market, which is there's a lot of them. There's a lot of other vendors besides the three that we mentioned. What are some of the pros and cons of working with a potentially lesser known, but still potentially viable product?
Well, the pros are that, it may be a case of just name recognition is not there, and a really, really good system you just haven't heard of them. I mean, for example, Priority is an Israeli-based company. We have offices all over the world and customers all over the world. But in Israel, we're essentially the SAP of Israel, if you want to say. Everybody knows us. We are the majority of the market there. It's a really good software package. We're all cloud. We do have the on-premise capability. So, but we're mostly cloud, and we're heavily cloud. So we have global implementations that we want to do on AWS and, implement everywhere. So with a company with a global footprint that's not the huge, and they can't afford the huge vendors, it's a really good option. Very well priced. Like I said, heavily cloud. And that's the way the market's going. Really nice capabilities in the areas of workflow. So I think the ones that are cloud vendors, a lot of times the workflow is easy to use. It's very low code, no code type of arrangement, where you don't have to program like some of the big ones. You have to program those kinds of workflows and things like that. So those can be some really good advantages. And a huge thing is just time to implement. We're talking 2-3 months in some cases with a small to medium-sized business on a good ERP cloud package. So if you're dealing with it, because it comes up on the cloud, the versions are upgraded, customizations come along with it. it's quite easy to implement, and it's easy to use too. I mean, a lot of the bigger ones are complicated and, busy screens and all kinds of things like that. So it's easier for user adoption. And you talk a lot about this, and you're absolutely right. In change management is a lot easier with a smaller package, maybe a lesser known package, but a really good solid one. And I think if they're running on AWS, for instance, that's the way we run, Microsoft backbone, and you don't have to maintain any of the databases or anything like that. You don't have to have a big IT staff. And a lot of the users can configure things like reports and workflows and things like that. Simple to use workflow tool is a huge thing. And a lot of the lesser known ones will have that.
Yeah. Yeah. And that flexibility, ease of use, change management, all that stuff. I mean, those are really good points that I agree with you on that. So given that there are these other options in the market that maybe they're lesser known, but they still are viable, and they have strengths in many cases that some of the other bigger ERP systems don't have, why is it that so many organizations get enamored by the big names? Is it as simple as what you said before, which is no one ever got fired for implementing A, B, or C, or is there more to it, or would you add to that list of why organizations become sort of blindly drawn to those systems?
Yeah, I think it's references, and they know of other companies that have implemented it, and so they feel more secure in that. But it's not necessarily the case. But I think that our main issue, or the main issue of a lot of the sort of second tier down, is that brand awareness. Simply, I mean, we've been around since 1986, and dominate the market over there. And there's a lot of other, companies also second tier that are like that, that are just unknown, because it's a big deal to have a massive marketing machine, and have Gartner and, people like that behind you in that upper quadrant. It stays pretty stable, as you know. It's SAP, Oracle, Microsoft, they're all in that top right magic quadrant. And then, maybe the second tier doesn't get the same sort of consideration from the big. And when you're dealing with Gartner, you're dealing with larger companies that they are only kind of looking at that upper quadrant, right? So they're not necessarily looking at the ones that are even just slightly down. So it's kind of reputation. It's kind of what the analyst firms like the Gartner say about it. And it's just safe, or
Right.
It's perceived as safe, which is kind of interesting, because if the time to implement is so huge, as the things that will dictate whether it's a failure or a success is the time to implement. The cost can be staggering. And if you're implementing it in a sort of a modular way, instead of some of the lesser known ones that have the whole footprint, including e-commerce and ERP and MES and all the things that link to it through APIs, it's a much more it's not a modular approach that some of the big ones take, right? So you might implement purchasing and accounts payable, right? But the other pieces are not there yet. So they're doing it in phases, and it takes a long time and a lot of consulting resources. You're usually dealing with a partner, whereas, some of the smaller ones, they do their own implementations, that they do their own product development, and you get a much more personal experience, if you will. And you get care. I mean, we're not, for instance, we're not taking people in the US. We're dealing mostly with our own implementations, with our own team. We have some very good partners, some big partners, and some small that can do implementations. But in general, we're not taking it and putting it off to a VAR and saying, put it over there and forget it. So,
Right.
and I think it's not just us, but it's some of the lesser known ones that really have to prove themselves. They have to have a personal touch. They have to have support that, is very responsive and things like that, and not pushed off to a VAR,
Right. So in your career then, what was it that drew you personally to these non-household name products? Not that they're, a lot of people have heard of Priority Software and Infor and some of the other systems you've worked with over the years. But what was it that drew you personally to the let's call it the smaller, not small, but smaller software vendors?
Yeah, so it just kind of transpired that way. I mean, when I joined Bond, I was recruited. I got an MBA, and I was recruited right out of school essentially, and I had a finance background. And I was recruited by Bond. Bond was sort of new in the U.S., and they were sort of the Dutch SAP, if you will. So they were very exciting. They were growing really fast. They just landed Boeing. We had Carrier. We had all these sort of enterprise level manufacturing companies. And I wanted to join the up and coming one. They used Jan Bond, who's the founder. He always used to say, "We're number two, but we're the best."
Right.
I wanted to join the up and coming one, and it just so happened that one was the one. And also, I'm fascinated, and I have been for 25 years that I've been doing this. I love manufacturing, so I was drawn to their kinds of clients, and I got to visit many large enterprise customers at that time. And first thing I would do is go to the shop floor. So I was a finance guy, so I did cost accounting and everything. And they'd say, go up to the finance office. And I'd say, no, I want to go down on the floor and see how you build this thing, because I was just fascinated with it. And then I kind of fell in love with both ERP, which I still do today, and manufacturing companies in particular. So that's how I got into it. And then so it just so happened that Infor bought Infor Global Solutions, which is kind of like that next, just right underneath Enterprise, and it's in your Battle of the Titans back when you were I think you still do that. Battle of the Titans, yeah. So it's like number 4, right? So they bought Bond, and they have a product called Infor LN, which is strictly manufacturing, strictly enterprise level, pretty much. And I developed a consulting firm in that, and I grew a consulting firm, and I just loved everything about it. So again, there were this next tier down. And then finally, when Priority bought my consulting business in 2016, I get my dates messed up.
A couple decades off there.
Yeah, 2016, I had the opportunity to build another one, here in the US. And that was a very exciting, having built a couple businesses and done exits before. It was a very exciting proposition. And I saw Priority as this kind of like the Bond, it's the next one up and coming, a lot of investment recently. And that was very exciting to me.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Very cool. And you just reminded me as you were talking through that response that, and I hadn't thought of this until you and I were talking just right now, but Bond was at some point, a larger player or a larger force in the industry than it is now. And it's just a good reminder that who we consider the big names, the big household names, or the big vendors, that changes over time too. You don't know who the next up and coming software vendor is going to be. You don't know which ones of the big guys are going to fall out of favor. I think there's an assumption that if you're a big household name, you're going to be around and viable for the long term. But we've seen it in technology, especially, but even other industries as well. You see that who's big today may not be tomorrow, and who's not big today could be. So it's an important reminder just to not worry too much about that. Market presence certainly is important, but what's really important is just the level of fit that the technology has or doesn't have with your organization.
Yeah, that's the biggest thing. I mean, the reputation is the reputation, right? I mean, there's marketing machines and there's great salespeople, and but there's you have to struggle maybe at the second tier there to get into sales cycles, to get into short lists and things like that. And you working with companies that are, you're more enterprise level, but you're getting into the small and medium-sized businesses as well. And if you keep an open mind, which you do, in evaluating these companies, you can find a really good fit for a company, that's less expensive and very forward-looking technology-wise. and also easy to implement and lower cost.
Mm.
And with the cloud, you got so many opportunities to just to do a global footprint, support a global growing business. That's also very important because these larger companies they'll have different ERPs, right? So different ERPs, different versions, different people running it, and the prospect of a company that's a second tier company that has a really good platform, a cloud platform, primarily, is that you can do a global business all on the same software, and you can use some strategies. And I was going to mention a couple strategies a little bit later on, but there's some strategies you can use to, in the interim, kind of get as many as you can up to the cloud, and that becomes sort of the backbone of your digital transformation. But at the same time, give yourself some time to adjust if you have on-premise, because I know this is something that comes up for you a lot. And I've heard you say that the cloud isn't necessarily right for everybody, or at least not right away. And there are procedures to do lift and shift and things like that, which are really good ones to consider long-term. But you want something that is kind of unite the systems as much as possible, and maybe get some analytics on top in the interim. So while you're building a cloud platform with maybe a second tier company, that in the meantime you can just sort of gradually do it, like in phases, right? Bring online a website with e-commerce, bring online Amazon, things like that. They can be done in a phased approach, but you don't have to worry in the meantime of all these different versions and different brands, and it's very difficult to support a global business if you have that kind of siloed thing going on.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And one thing you mentioned just a couple minutes ago about the name recognition, and you had mentioned earlier when we were talking, you talked about Gartner's Magic Quadrant, and there's a lot of CIOs and executive level people that will look at those Magic Quadrants from Gartner and reports from Forrester and whatnot, and base a lot of their decision or use that as a big input. But I think one thing that organizations need to do is remember that just because someone's on the top right quadrant of the Magic Quadrant of Gartner's Magic Quadrant doesn't necessarily mean those products are better. It may mean that there's a certain amount of money that was paid to commission that study that was paid for by the softwares. And so you have to look at the game that's being played behind the scenes. So, the industry analysts' reports, I don't want to say ignore them, but you do have to take those with a grain of salt, because they're oftentimes funded by the same software vendors that are showing up in the top right corner of the Magic Quadrant. And so you have to,
right.
Just because someone's not in the Magic Quadrant or not in the top right quadrant doesn't mean it's not going to be a good fit for your organization, and vice versa.
Yeah, and also the big SIs, obviously they're biased towards the large enterprise software, because that's their business. They're in the business of the Accentures and the Deloittes, like you mentioned. They're in the business of enterprise software, and they have practices in each of those, the SAPs, the Oracles, and sometimes the Microsoft, but certainly those top two. And what they're going to recommend pretty much. And if you see, and you see other ratings agencies, I mean, we've been working with G2, for instance, that are more, kind of newer and focused on reviews and social media mentions and things like that. And we've been moving up into that sort of their upper right quadrant, which is called high performers. So that's driven by reviews. I mean, in a next tier down system, your customers, if they love you and they love the consulting job that was done, you can move up in the ranks of G2. It's not a pay for play in that sense. It's more driven. It's more driven by reviews and social media and things like that, and the experiences that users have. We have a very passionate base, so you'll also hear, if you talk to our customers, you'll hear that the consulting job, that was a big factor, and the people that we're working with, they trusted, and they were, if they're not big SIs or VARs that don't really have too much of a connection to the software company itself, then you might have a more distant experience. It's a good experience to deal with the software company itself, and to have good consultants like the A-team consultants without, pushing it completely off the VARs.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's a good point. And it's a good reminder too, that there's just a lot of different variables you have to look at, when you're considering whether or not someone's in the top quadrant or, a top ranking. Is that the right criteria that's most relevant to your organization too? That's the other factor you have to look at as well.
It's very important.
Yeah. So when organizations are considering the big options, the smaller options, and everything in between, what are some of the key criteria that you think organizations should be using to define what the best fit technology or technologies are for an organization?
So I think cloud is a huge part. The ability to customize without in a very low code, no code type manner, and to have those a cloud platform that you can bring along the versions, but still hold on to the customizations you've done, and very highly configurable. So in terms of screens, in terms of workflows, a business process management type tool that's behind it is a huge thing without programming, because some of the ones would have workflow with programming required. And I guess also the consulting that goes with it, the quality and the ability to have a really good consulting team is a huge thing. And the ability to connect. I mean, these days, the ability to connect via APIs and have standard connections with different things as part of an overall digital transformation is very important too. So it has to be highly connected or connectable via CRM systems, e-commerce, MES, like I was mentioning, so that they have that kind of footprint and can be connected and also configured in a very nice way. I mean, you mentioned that Microsoft Dynamics, I noticed you switched the positions there, Microsoft and NetSuite, and the primary reason being it's very customizable. Now that's also dangerous in the sense that, if you can customize it so much, then you go down a rabbit hole, or you develop a vertical that gets left behind, or you're dealing with a VAR that only does that vertical. So you need it to be configurable, customizable, very good workflow, very good connectivity, and also there was one other thing I was going to mention. I'll think of it in a second, but those are kind of the criteria there, right. I would say.
Yeah. It's a really, really good point. There's a lot of different criteria that organizations should be considering. And one of the things you made me realize too, is we're talking, or as you were talking about some of the things to consider, is that, a lot of times organizations focus on what the software or the technology can do and where the right fit is with the organization. But for any given product, even if it's the product you end up choosing for your organization, I found that it's equally helpful, in my opinion, to also understand what the weaknesses are. Not because you want to doubt your decision, or not because you want to create doubt within the organization, but because you have to know what those weaknesses are, or what the deficiencies are. And you gave a good example with Microsoft. Microsoft generally, or let me back up. I'm sure Microsoft would say that's a strength, is their flexibility, of course. But many organizations view that as a strength too, the flexibility of the product. But what they don't think about is, well, that flexibility is good because it gives us a certain amount of leeway in terms of how we can set up our workflows and configure the software. But it can also get you into a lot of trouble, like you mentioned. So you do have to recognize that for every strength, there's usually some sort of weakness that goes along with that. And you do have to understand that, because those are the risks that you've got to manage. And so in the case of Microsoft, just to pick on that example, since you brought it up, if that is the route you take, then let's look at those downside risks of what you're about to jump into, because that's where budgets tend to overrun. That's where projects get delayed. That's where just general risk comes into play. So I guess that's another point of consideration too, is if you have any sort of option where you feel like there's just all strengths and no weaknesses and it's a silver bullet, then chances are you're just not fully understanding what the pros and cons are.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I would add to that to say there's certain things like you mentioned in NetSuite, the fact that they have suite success. So these are pre-configured business models that may be useful, but if they're not, customizable or configurable, they kind of can be a restriction, actually can be kind of rigid. And the workflows that go with it, dashboards and things like that are, out of the box, great, but the methodology of implementing using a relatively rigid business model, if you're not able to adapt to the business rather than the other way around, then that can be a downside, so you've mentioned that before, and you're very right that selling a business model is great to get you started. But what happens is you're dealing with a business. Every business is different, except for finance, which I think they're pretty much all the same, right? But operationally, everybody is a bit different, right? And so if you have a very rigid business model that you're trying to force people into, then that can be limiting, let's say.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you on that. What about just sort of a little bit more forward looking here? And you and I have been around for a while to see sort of the ups and downs and the evolutions of the industry. Where do you see the ERP software industry headed in the future? I know you may have touched on a few of these a few minutes ago, but maybe we could build on those or add to anything you'd suggest are some of the trends within the ERP software market right now.
Sure. So the biggest thing I think with the new generation, and I'm an old dog trying to learn new tricks, but the new generation is completely mobile. Almost everything they do is mobile. And with factories and things, I'm dealing just mostly with the manufacturing vertical. When you get there, I mean, everything is robotics. It's replacing people. People are retiring, and then the industry in general is suffering from, guys retiring, and it had been, sort of a male-dominated, older type industry, and they need to be more inclusive, I think, of women and minorities and things like that, and try to recruit. But it also means that the ERP software itself has to be very easy to learn. It has to be very easy to configure, and it has to be mobile, and it has to be you have to have the ability to configure. I'll call it configure, with things like barcoding, with mobile scanners, with the WMS, guiding them with picking and packing, for instance, automating those processes, automating with machines, with an MES, for example, connecting those things, and allow people to not focus so much on learning a big ERP system, but something smaller that can be learned easily. And it's almost completely mobile. I see, and the artificial intelligence also, being able to enter things faster. You don't have as many people. You don't necessarily want to develop these kind of late stage learning on something, or having old skills. For the millennials and everything's online. They want to just take their phone and they want to scan it into a mobile app and upload things to the system through a mobile app. They want to be able to scan to receive something, and so on. So it has to be very highly automated, and you'll see that they also need to be connected to e-commerce systems. So as people move away from retail stores, for instance, and they move to Amazon, so they got Seller Central, and they want to make a connection with that. So software has to be able to do that very easily. So those are some of the trends that I think are coming. Got to get those young people into this, get them learning ERP software, get them learning it in high school, or maybe even, I don't know, it definitely in high school and college to have programs like that. And
Yeah.
it's kind of like manufacturing in general, right? The same trend you're seeing is a trend to much more automation, much less people driven, and learning like apprenticeships, for example. I've been in some of these kind of manufacturing 4.0 type conferences where they talk about advances in manufacturing, but at the same time, the people that work in the factory are not, they're not doing manual labor anymore, right? They're doing things like they need to maintain the robots. They need to program an ERP system or configure an ERP system. So those are different skills,
Right.
So traditionally, guys like me, I learned an ERP software of the past, and I want to have a business management system of the future, and I want to bring along millennials, with
Right.
me and minorities with me. It's a huge thing, minorities and women leadership in this area, and getting them to learn. It's like the STEM, in a way. We need women engineers, for instance. We need
Hmm.
people that learn it early, and we need to expand the labor pool, and we need to start earlier because we're retiring. I mean, I'm not too far from retirement myself, so I need the next generation to come behind me, and they're going to come with their cell phones and their iPads, and that's what
Yeah.
they're going to bring to the table.
Well, you bring up a good point too. That diversity that you're seeing a lot of the world, a lot of cultures throughout the world that are promoting and sort of trying to advance that view of diversity within organizations in general. You're seeing that same push in technology, and I have to wonder, and I never thought of this until you were saying it, but I have to wonder if that might help our industry become a little bit not only diverse in terms of creating opportunities for more people to get involved in the technology space, but also to maybe bring in some fresh thinking to where we're not myopically doing the same things we've been doing for the last 20 or 30 years that has led to the same dismal results for
Yeah.
these sorts of implementations. So maybe having some diversity and some additional brains and different ways of thinking will help us get there. I don't know. That's just more of a question than anything.
Yeah, and also for example, in Africa, you guys are in Africa,
Mhm.
and I think that's wonderful because it's an emerging market. They're hungry for it. They've been underserved from a technology point of view, and you need things like we have a offline capability to upload orders or to work offline, and then when they get an internet connection, they can sync it up to the ERP. So in Africa, I mean, everybody has a cell phone, and they have cell towers, but they don't necessarily have widely used internet. So you're not going to be all the time connected to a cloud system, right? So you might have to
Right.
enter something offline. But I think the most exciting part of you guys being there, you can start a generation of Africans that want to get involved early, and we can have training programs and apprenticeships and all kinds of things like that. Because in manufacturing, there, for instance,
Yeah.
when they start it right and start it with new technology, but they also have to have connectivity is a huge
Mhm.
part of
Yeah.
developing countries, and how they consume technology.
Right. Even more mobile in many cases than here
Yeah.
where you are in the US or here in Europe where I'm at. I mean, it's a lot of times those cultures and economies are built more on mobile devices, even more so than the rest of the world. So that's back to your earlier point about mobility being a future trend. I agree with you largely for that reason.
Hmm.
Here's a question or more of a comment, I guess I'd say, that I'd maybe see what your thoughts are here. And this is from Shikar on YouTube. Makes a comment, near future likely to be light, agile, modular, and customizable. What are your thoughts there? Do you think that's where ERP software is headed? Do you see exceptions to that, or what are your thoughts?
All of the above.
Yeah.
All of the above. That's where it's headed, and it has to be that.
What about, so let me just play a devil's advocate though. What about a large organization, a Fortune 500 organization, the ones that we're maybe alluding to without mentioning them by name, or maybe I was alluding to them without mentioning them by name. the ones that are
Mhm.
more likely to go with an SAP or Oracle, or one of the big names. What about those cases where they're trying to scale, or they're trying to create more of a common operating model, or they're driving cost out of the organization? Do you still see this being true in those cases, or do you see them being more drawn to that, call it the more monolithic way of the historic monolithic way of
Right.
implementing technology?
I think they can still be drawn to the right way to do it. I mean, the old monolithic way is not sustainable. At least that's my
Right.
opinion. I mean, uh, you have to move, I think, eventually to a cloud platform. People are not going to have these huge IT groups and things like that, and the needing to upgrade the database and all of these things. And they want to be connected to the cloud through, just a connection, an internet connection with a browser, as opposed to a VPN, logging into various on-premise systems that are disconnected. I just don't think it's a sustainable model. Ultimately, and also the education plays into that as well, because who's learning, as I shouldn't mention any particular ones, but who's learning the huge enterprise software packages, and who's
Right.
learning even how to use them.
Right.
Yeah, I just simply think it's not sustainable.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right. And we've sort of exposed over the years, we've exposed the weaknesses and um, the limitations of that model. I think it had its place in history, or its place, in helping organizations scale at one point. But now,
Mhm.
I think even in cases where you do have an organization that's trying to scale up for growth, and they're trying to create a certain amount of commonality across the operations, I think there's still a really important role for flexible solutions, in
Mhm.
that even if you're trying to create a common operating model, chances are you may want to do that common operating model a little bit differently than the way your peers are, because you're trying to be different. You're trying to create a
Mhm.
competitive or whatever. And in that case, you need that flexibility. And I could see a lot of these systems moving more towards what I think you were alluding to earlier in the conversation, moving towards more of a platform focused approach,
Yes.
versus these are the specific workflows, or this is how the software works. It's sort of creating more of an open architecture, and
Mhm.
creating more opportunities to create, an app store or third party bolt ons or whatever it is, that gives you
Mhm.
more flexibility in that way too. So I think maybe that's just a different way of thinking, or ways we need to think about software a little bit differently going forward.
Yeah, I mean, as long as it can handle growth, it can handle. I've seen thousands of users on a second tier. For example, I think you're probably familiar with a company called Flex, which used to be Flextronics. It's the second
Mm.
biggest, component manufacturer in the world. They run Infor LN, but they were on Bond, and now they run Infor LN, pretty much through the ecosystem. But we found that there were a lot of, when I came over to Israel, I started, the first thing I did was I came over to Israel and I said, can I get a look at, some of your customers? Can we visit some of your customers? And they said, yeah, we got this company Flex. And I was like, because I had finished an implementation with my old company at Flex, putting in their financials and their global finance model, including shared services, but that was on Infor LN. So I knew that was the global path. And I said, they said, well, they run priority here. So we went over to the plant, and they told the story of, hey, this is a highly configurable system. I hadn't seen it really in practice yet. So they said this is very highly configurable. So we tried to go to the other system, more monolithic system, and then they switched back because of the configurability, because of the workflow, a lot of the things that the other system didn't have, or they were very difficult to learn. I mean, they just like something was easy to learn, and it turns out it was scalable because they have thousands of users. And I said, well, I mean, it's on AWS. They're just running Chrome browser there, and they can just connect up, and it's fast and it's configurable and easy to learn, or relatively, versus a monolithic one. And they just chose to do that. So as long as, I guess my point is that as long as it's scalable, and a second tier system can be very scalable. It's not just necessarily small and medium-sized businesses. So you want something that is scalable, that is on the cloud, that does allow a global footprint. That's very important too. Multi-site, multi-currency, multi-company, intercompany transactions, consolidated financials, all of these things are, can be had with a second tier system.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. And here's a question from Third Stage Consulting Group. I know them, by the way. But this is from our team at Third Stage is asking the question, if young people are interested in this field of ERP software and digital transformation, what are some steps they can take to establish a career in the space?
That would be a you question, wouldn't it?
Yeah, actually, now that you say that, that is something our team would do, is they would try to put me on the spot and ask me instead of our guest. Kyler, who's our marketing person, who's also the co-host of my podcast, tends to put me on the spot a lot. So, yeah, I could take a shot at it and I'd be curious to see what you think, Dan. But I'd say that, first of all, the more you can learn if you're still in school, the more you can learn about supply chain and operations, I think the better. That's a really good foundation, is just to understand business and understand how processes work within organizations. And it doesn't have to be supply chain, by the way. It doesn't have to be manufacturing. Like you and I both have backgrounds in manufacturing, but it could be finance or accounting, or just understand business. I think that's a core fundamental thing. And if you can get an internship at a technology company or with a consulting firm just to learn the ropes a bit, I think that helps quite a bit. But I guess my main advice to anyone that wants to go into digital transformation, either as a college grad or as someone who's just mid-career or some point in their career and they want to switch to consulting, I'd say just learn as much as you can about both sides of transformation, the digital and the business part of it. Because I think if you can do both, that's almost a prerequisite or a must-have to be good at consulting. But the problem is a lot of consultants tend to focus on one or the other. They know business really well, but not technology, or vice versa. What are your thoughts, though? What do you think it takes for a younger person or someone who's trying to switch careers? How do you get into this space?
Well, I think that you need to get it early, in schools and universities and things like that. And so the business learning, the concepts behind things like finance, for example, having that earlier, and then getting the basic conceptual training, if you will, focusing on that. And then I think it's incumbent on, organizations such as yours to develop programs that people can take earlier. So, start getting into even high school. I was talking to Kyler. She said the Lockheed Martin guy last week was talking about elementary schools. They're going back into elementary schools, and these kids, you got to give them credit for being really smart, and they're very tech savvy, right? They use the mobile devices. I see them flying around on those things. I'm like, wow. And, they're learning Excel and Word, and, they're learning all the sort of backbone technology that you need to at a very early age. So I think you can layer in the digital transformation tools, right? So the ERP, the data science, the analytics, all of those things at a relatively early age. I could see it. I'd love to teach a high school class in ERP software. I think it'd be wonderful. Just go and maybe that's what I'll do in my next life.
Yeah, like a lot of people do, and that's having that sort of experience and being able to take it back to the college, the future workforce within college, I think is a great idea. And it was interesting for those that aren't familiar with the Lockheed Martin guest, it's last week's podcast. We had a guest who is the head of workforce planning and analytics, and we talked a lot about how they're building their workforce, how they manage the workforce in general, but also in a post-pandemic world, talking about the Great Resignation and all the turmoil in the marketplace right now. So check that out on my Transformation Ground Control podcast that was out last week. You can find that interview. I believe it's episode number 56, if I remember correctly, but don't quote me on that because my memory is terrible when it comes to stuff like that. But and it was interesting though to hear him talk about how they're looking at sixth grade on as sort of proactively developing that workforce and the skills that are needed to be successful in the future, but also so they have a work pool that's capable. I think it's pretty smart thinking, but you have to have that long-term mindset to be able to think ahead like that. And I think that's something that, our industry that you and I are in could learn a lot from that.
Mm-hmm.
There was another question here that I wanted to ask here, or have you answer maybe here, is again from Third Stage Consulting Group. Would you say that the cloud or more open source system would require more internal IT support? And I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, because I tend to have a controversial opinion on this, or either that, or it's just there's no clear cut consensus in the industry on this topic. But maybe just, in the context of managing a more flexible product that's either cloud or open source or any sort of technology that, low code is another one where you, back to your Microsoft example before, where it's like you have the tool sets and the abilities to change the software. Does that create a need for more IT support, to be able to manage stuff, or what are your...
No, just the opposite.
Okay.
Because you're not with an on-premise system, you're maintaining everything, right? You're maintaining database, for example, your networking, customization code, all of those things are being handled by an internal IT staff. And, in a company of some size, it's going to be a big one. Cloud is taking a lot of that out of the picture, right? And it's all getting upgraded at the same time, and as long as it's multi-tenant and you're able to, connect to that, and you're able to bring along customizations, for instance, and put the power in the hands of the end users, the key users and the end users, right? If you have a workflow tools, great example, to set up a workflow in a good workflow system in a business process management takes seconds. There's no programming involved in it. You say, here's the status, and when it moves through this status, send an email, send a text. These are very easy things to set up. So it reduces the IT staff. It can reduce it significantly, or better yet, keep some IT staff, but retrain them on things that are much more value add, rather than coming around and installing somebody's laptop.
Right.
You got Microsoft 365 for that. You don't need to, have somebody come around and install stuff on people's laptop. What you want is to get the information out of these various systems and train people on more of the high value type activities, right? Aligning with the KPIs of the business, being able to see dashboards and analytics that are all along the same lines as the business needs, right? Structuring those things and putting the power of report writer, for instance, that was used to be a huge thing when I was at Bond, for instance. Most of the customizations were just reports, right? You had to write code to get a new report. So if you wanted to add a field or something like that, that's a whole new program. And I would go into a company like Flex, you can imagine, they had hundreds and hundreds of customizations, and probably close to half of them were reports, because they didn't have a report generator in the hands of an end user that could do that. It had to be coded. So, right. And when you go to the next version, every one of them had to be reprogrammed,
Right.
But the thing to do would be to give a powerful reporting tool some BI and some dashboard capability, which that's what we do. We embed the analytics in there, and allow an end user to configure their workflow, to configure their screens, to set up role-based home pages, things like that with the correct flow. And if you can do that in a tool that is very intuitive, and just say, you're a buyer, you have all the purchasing things, purchase order reports, just put it on the desktop there and allow them to work with it without customization. So that should be the goal, I think, is to focus on high value add type procedures, and more of the data analytics. And that's also where I think you're going with the digital transformation is you want, and that's also part of change management, is when you're retraining people to be, even an IT staff, you want to repurpose them away from putting software on somebody's computers to using a data, analytics tool to measure the business.
Yeah. Yeah. So if anything, it just changes the skill sets and the focus of an organization, kind of moving from more of a reactive support fix type of mentality to more of a strategic mindset, which I think that's what a lot of organizations want, but repurposing or retooling, reskilling the IT department to not only change their skill sets, but also just behaviorally and culturally. How do you shift that mindset? That's a whole change management undertaking in and of itself. But I think that technology itself, like you said, is a driver for a lot of those changes that need to happen organizationally.
Yeah, I mean, it takes away the drudgery to a large extent, right? We're all in huge competition now for talent.
Mm-hmm.
You don't want a drudgery job that was the last generation's job, probably my generation's job. You want it to be interesting, and you want it to be focused on, things that drive the business and allow you to make an impact, rather than entering a purchase order. I mean, I can see the day when artificial intelligence you say create a purchase order, and I go boop, put a purchase order in there instead of you having to manually enter stuff and take stuff off of a spreadsheet or take something from email and enter a sales order. I mean, those are all kind of drudgery tasks. And if you have a much more interesting, I guess, or exciting job role, which would be something like an analytics person or a data scientist, those things are being taught in school now, and they're very high value add for a digital transformation, right? You don't want them focused on learning how to enter a PO in an ERP system.
Right. Yeah. Well put. So maybe just to bring this all full circle and to wrap up the conversation here, what advice would you give to organizations that are about to embark on either an ERP implementation and or a general digital transformation? What sorts of, headline advice would you give to those teams and organizations?
So I would say that they need to be prepared for a change in their business, a way to facilitate their business. They need to sort of start gathering together what are our processes now, and developing, starting to think ahead of using consultants or other resources to help design the processes, the to-be processes, and make sure that they have organizational readiness, because particularly in a small business, people have their real jobs. I like to say, you got your real job. So you need to be having the resources that can participate in an effort like that, both ERP and in general digital transformation. So you have to have the capability, and you have to look ahead and develop a team, and, get them ready for the effort, and have the C levels behind it, because if it's not just that you have to do it, if it's the shiny new thing, right? It's not that you just have to do it and get something in place. You want to make it strategic to match with the business.
Right. Yep. Yeah. You want that alignment with what you're trying to accomplish as an organization, making sure that transformation, that technology initiative supports that overarching strategy for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Well, good. So how can people get a hold of you? What's the best way to connect with you? Is it on LinkedIn? What's your website address?
Yes, the website address is just priority-software.com.
Okay.
And my LinkedIn profile is out there.
Yes, you're very active. You might be more active than I am on LinkedIn. So you're one of my peers that likes to post about this crazy digital transformation stuff pretty often.
Yeah, I think you saw me pop up on the digital stratosphere a bunch of times, right?
Yeah.
I was in line asking questions and making comments, and so LinkedIn is a big thing for me. I'm there. I'm participating, trying to participate and add some value to conversations about lots of things, mainly manufacturing and digital transformation or ERP software. Those are kind of my big interests. But I try to pitch in on conversations. Like I saw that thing about customization, and it was just a statement, I think, just something like, you better watch out for customization or something like that. And I saw there was like 500 comments under there. And I just started getting involved in that. And I posted it on LinkedIn. I said, hey, this is a really engaging discussion about a very hot topic. I mean, customization will kill you if you don't do it right, right? So,
Right.
that experience, you see the LinkedIn conversation. Yours are great because you have this live inline questions and things, and you had an opportunity for us, and you're answering them in line, which is phenomenal too, during that digital stratosphere, which I thought was fantastic. And I tried to get as much as I could, and then just log in and say, hey, I'm here, and I want to ask a question. And I got so many people reaching out on LinkedIn, and I was also reaching out to all the people that I saw. And you see analysts coming in there, you see, really high execs that really know this business really well. You see technology experts, you see just people that are worried about a digital transformation, or, oh my God, this is going to bring a change and I'm going to lose my job, and things like that. You had those people as well making conversations. And I was into it. I was in there pounding away with the questions and everything. But I think just on LinkedIn is a really huge thing, and to get involved in conversations, share posts, important things in the industry. I share manufacturing. I share ERP software stuff, and just be very active and connect to people. All the people that were on the digital stratosphere, I was already connected with you for years, but there was Brad Feeks, there was Kyler, there was lots of really talented people that you had on there, and I sent them a LinkedIn, or they sent me a LinkedIn, and it's just great to have these connections and have these conversations and share these conversations and reply to a post and say, hey, I have an opinion on that, right?
Yeah.
You might have some experience that might help. Might help somebody else. And, I've been in the trenches for 25 odd years doing this stuff. So, some of it is just experience, and if you can lend your experience on a conversation on LinkedIn, I think it's a great thing. And I love your stream. I love your digital stratosphere. I hope we get back to the time where we can do it in person.
Yeah. Those are all the best.
That would be phenomenal to go back to that.
That's our plan.
I love Colorado, so I'll see you out there.
Yep. Yeah, that's the goal and plan, is that we do that in person next time. And those that missed our digital stratosphere event, it was 3 days of different sessions and streams on different topics. You can go to stratosphere2022.com and you can see some of the sessions that Dan was involved with, and all the interaction and the chat that happened in parallel with the actual presentation. I thought was just as valuable, if not more valuable, than the speakers themselves. And I actually go back, and I haven't watched them all yet, but going back to watch those has been really, really interesting. So anyone can go stream it at stratosphere2022.com. But I want to thank you, Dan, for being here today. This was a really helpful conversation, and I'm hope that this opens the eyes to people listening, just ways to think through your options and to make sure you're not, closed off to any viable technological options that might be good fits for your organization. So hopefully we've accomplished that here today. I want to thank the audience for all the great conversation here today. Thank you, Dan, for being here. And
thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's great to have you. And yeah, it was super fun. And we do these live streams same time every week. So we'll have our next live stream next Tuesday. And this interview it'll get edited and polished up. It'll become part of my weekly Transformation Ground Control podcast, which will come out. It comes out every Wednesday, but this episode with Dan on it will be a week from tomorrow. So be sure to check that out on Transformation Ground Control, which you can also watch on YouTube, LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, as well as all the audio podcast platforms as well, like Google, Amazon, Spotify, Pandora, all those platforms. So thanks again, everyone, for being here. Hope you all have a great rest of your week, and we'll see you next time. Take care.
Thank you.